Have you ever noticed that the more you've loved someone, the more you've lost them? Not love in the abstract sense, not the kind of love you read about in poetry or see in movies, but that specific, defining moment when you decided, perhaps without even realizing it, that this person was the most important thing you had. And then something changed. Not in them, in you, and in the way they looked at you. There is something that most men don't understand about attraction, about power, about relationships, and it is one of those truths that hurts to hear because it means accepting that for years you have been doing exactly the opposite of what you needed to do. Not out of malice, not out of weakness, but because no one taught you, because the world told you that love is demonstrated through sacrifice, through constant presence, through saying yes to everything, through putting yourself last so that the other person comes first. And you believed it. And right now, as you listen to this, you may be thinking about someone, a specific person, a specific situation, a pattern that has repeated itself too many times in your life to be a coincidence. Because this is not a coincidence. It is a mechanism, a psychological mechanism that has been operating in silence for centuries, and today we are going to dissect it together. More than 500 years ago, a man named Machiavelli wrote something that historians quickly categorized as a political manual, a cold guide for princes and rulers. What no one said out loud, what everyone whispers when reading between the lines, is that what Machiavelli understood was not about governing kingdoms. It was about understanding human nature in its most naked form, without ornaments, without illusions, without the stories we tell ourselves to feel better. And what I am going to share with you today is anchored in that understanding. Not because Machiavelli was a genius of love or relationships, but because he was someone who looked at human beings as they truly are, not as they would like to be, and wrote about it with a precision that remains uncomfortable 5 centuries later. So, if you are willing to hear something uncomfortable, something that can change the way you relate to yourself and to others, stay. Because what comes next is not cheap motivation. It is not the typical advice to love yourself more. It is a psychological dissection of why you lose attraction, why you lose respect, why you lose the people you desire most, and what you need to understand at the deepest level of yourself so that this stops happening. Let's start at the beginning with the most common mistake, the one you've probably made yourself. At some point in your life, someone mattered to you so much that without realizing it, you stopped mattering to yourself. Not all at once. It was gradual. It was a small concession here, a minor surrender there, a silence when you should have spoken, a smile when you should have set a boundary. And each of those small decisions was sending a message, not the message you wanted to send, that of "I love you, I'm here for you." The real message the other person received was different. It was, "I don't value myself enough to demand to be treated well." As the novelist Ernest Hemingway wrote, and the words have taken on a life of their own because so many connect with the emotions they express. The most painful thing is losing yourself in the process of loving someone too much and forgetting that you are special too. At its heart, that insight is about balance. Loving another person should never come at the cost of losing respect for yourself. The problem begins when a person slowly stops valuing their own feelings, ambitions, and identity. They may stop pursuing hobbies, distance themselves from friends, ignore their own goals, or constantly put their own needs last. Psychology has been studying this for decades. There is a phenomenon that research has called the paradox of need, and it is so counterintuitive that when you first hear it, you almost don't want to believe it. The paradox works like this. The more you need someone, the more visible that need is, the less attractive you become to that person. Not because they are cruel, not because they don't care about you, but because the human brain has an instinctive response to the need of others. And that response is not desire, it is distance. Think about it from your own experience. When someone has attached themselves to you in a way that made you uncomfortable, when someone depended on your messages to feel good, when someone reorganized their entire life around you in a way you never asked for, what did you feel? Attraction? Desire? Or a strange kind of pressure, an urge to create distance, to breathe? Exactly. Now, imagine that you have been that person for someone else, and the hard part is that you probably have. Probably in some relationship, at some point, you made another person the axis around which your life revolved. And you did it out of love, out of the genuine intention to show that person they mattered to you. But the effect was the opposite of what you expected. Machiavelli understood this in a way that is brutal in its clarity. He wrote that men in general judge more by their eyes than by their hands. That is to say, what they perceive carries infinitely more weight than what actually occurs. They are not evaluating you by your intentions. They are evaluating you by what you project. And what you project when you place someone at the center of your existence is personal scarcity, the absence of self-worth, the most powerful signal of insecurity that exists, because you don't have to say it in words. It is transmitted in every gesture, in every decision, in every time you choose that person above yourself. And here comes something I need you to understand very clearly, because if you don't, everything else is going to sound like manipulation. And it isn't. We are not talking about becoming someone cold. We are not talking about playing psychological games or pretending indifference or treating anyone badly. We are talking about something far deeper and far more difficult than any of that. We are talking about developing real value, a real purpose, an emotional stability that doesn't depend on whether another person chooses you or not. Because there is a fundamental difference between the man who doesn't need validation because he has worked on himself until he has a life that satisfies him, and the man who pretends not to need it as a tactic to seem more attractive. The first generates genuine respect. The second generates confusion for a while and then collapses because what has no roots cannot sustain itself. The modern writer Mark Manson has articulated this with striking clarity. Neediness occurs when you place a higher priority on what others think of you than what you think of yourself. Anytime you alter your words or behavior to fit someone else's needs rather than your own, that is needy. He also observed that all performance is neediness. The less needy a man is, the more attractive he will be to women on average. The needier he is, the less attractive he will be. You cannot fake non-neediness for more than a moment. These are not tactics. They are reflections of a man's relationship with himself. Let's talk about how respect works, because there is something about it that very few people understand correctly. Respect is not asked for. It is not negotiated. It is not earned by being kind to someone or making sacrifices for someone or always being available for someone. Respect is an instinctive response that the human brain generates when it perceives coherence. When it perceives that the person in front of it knows what they want and is willing to sacrifice external approval to maintain it. There is a study I find fascinating in this context. Researchers at Harvard University analyzed behavioral patterns in relationships for years and reached a conclusion that challenges everything we had been taught. They found that people who set clear boundaries and maintain them even when that creates conflict are consistently perceived as more attractive, more trustworthy, and more respectable than those who avoid conflict at all costs by being compliant. Why? Because a clear boundary is a declaration of identity. It is the most honest way that exists of saying, I know who I am and what I am willing to tolerate. And that clarity, that internal coherence, is exactly what activates respect in the other person. Now, I want you to think about the times you broke one of your own limits to avoid losing someone. The times you said yes when you wanted to say no. The times you endured behavior that made you feel small because you were afraid that if you set a condition, the other person would leave. And I want you to ask yourself something. Did it work? Did that person respect you more for it? Did the relationship improve? Or did the other person unconsciously respect you less because they had just seen that their actions had no consequences? Machiavelli had a phrase about this that is devastating in its precision. He said it is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. And this phrase has been misunderstood for centuries, torn from its context, used to justify all kinds of authoritarian behavior. But if you read it in its real context, if you understand what Machiavelli actually meant, the revelation is different. He was not talking about inspiring fear in a literal sense. He was talking about the fact that people cannot take you for granted. He was talking about the fact that there must be a real consequence for bad behavior. He was talking about the fact that when someone crosses a line, there has to be something to lose. And when there is nothing to lose, when you demonstrate that you'll stay regardless of how you're treated, the other person doesn't interpret that as love. They interpret it as the absence of alternatives. This is basic psychology. It is the same principle that explains why we value what is scarce more than what is abundant. Why water is worth little when there is plenty of it and is gold when it runs out. Your presence, your attention, your time have enormous value if you give them selectively and consciously. They have a value close to zero when you hand them over unconditionally to anyone who comes into your life. As one observer put it, scarcity creates value. Abundance lowers and levels it out. Human beings naturally value what is scarce. When your time is scarce and you have an abundance of options, you get the best choices and negotiating position. Another reflection notes that scarcity of love creates its need. Abundance kills its longevity. Anything gains in attraction the moment it starts to run away from us. The principle is simple but profound. What is always available is rarely treasured. And then we arrive at the concept I am most interested in exploring with you because it is the one most misunderstood and the one that does the most damage when it is not correctly grasped. Emotional autonomy. It is not distance. It is not coldness. It is not building a wall around yourself so that no one can hurt you. Emotional autonomy is the ability to feel with all the intensity you are capable of, to love, to desire, to get excited without your fundamental well-being depending on the outcome. Let me explain it another way. There are two types of people who sit down to negotiate an important contract. The first desperately needs that contract. Their finances, their self-esteem, their sense of self-worth depend on that negotiation going well, and the other party smells it. There is no need to say it. It comes through in how they speak, in how they concede too quickly, in how they accept conditions they shouldn't accept out of fear of losing the deal. The second has worked hard enough to have options. They don't need that specific contract to survive. They want it. They are interested in it. They are willing to work for it. But if it doesn't work out, there is another path. And that internal position, that security that comes not from arrogance but from genuine preparation, changes absolutely everything. They negotiate from strength, from calm, from clarity. And paradoxically, that makes them far more likely to get what they want. Relationships work in exactly the same way. The man who has built a life that satisfies him, who has friends who matter to him, projects that excite him, an honest relationship with himself, that man, when he enters a romantic relationship, does so from choice, not from need. He says, "I choose you," instead of, "I need you." And there is a psychological abyss between those two statements. "I need you" transfers the power. "I choose you" keeps it distributed equitably. And this is where I want to talk to you about something that is rarely mentioned, but that is fundamental for understanding why so many relationships follow patterns that neither party consciously wants to follow: anxious attachment. Psychologists have spent decades studying the attachment styles we develop in childhood that activate automatically in our adult relationships. One of those styles, anxious attachment, is characterized by constant hypervigilance toward the other's signals, by a catastrophic interpretation of silences, delays in responding to a message, changes in mood, by a constant need for confirmation that everything is okay, that the other is still there, that they haven't left. As one observer put it, the tragedy of an attachment is that if its object is not attained, it causes unhappiness. But if it is attained, it does not cause happiness. It merely causes a flash of pleasure followed by weariness, and it is always accompanied, of course, by the anxiety that you may lose the object of your attachment. And what is most interesting, what makes this a psychological trap so difficult to escape from, is that the behavior generated by anxious attachment produces exactly the result it fears most. The anxious person constantly seeks confirmation because they fear abandonment, but that constant search for confirmation, that visible need, that suffocating presence, ends up generating the very distance they feared so much. It is a loop, a circle you cannot exit by doing more of the same. Machiavelli would have called it the error of the prince who multiplies concessions hoping to buy loyalty. Now, I want to talk about something that may be the most difficult part of all this. The pain that comes before clarity. Because there is a moment in the lives of many men, perhaps you have already lived it, perhaps you are living it right now, when they realize they have been building their identity around a person, and when that person leaves, or begins to pull away, or simply stops responding the way they used to, the world collapses. Not metaphorically, almost physically. There is a feeling of emptiness that resembles nothing else, a disorientation that goes beyond sadness. And what usually happens in that moment is that the man makes one of two decisions. The first is to pursue more intensely, to call more often, to send more messages, to try to convince the other person to stay with more arguments, more gestures, more proof of love. And that, which psychologically makes complete sense because the brain in panic mode seeks to recover what it has lost at any cost, does exactly the opposite of what it needs to do. The second decision is harder, but it is the only one that works. It is the decision to look inward, to ask not, "What can I do to get her back?" but "How did I come to depend so much on this person to feel good about myself? What is there in me that I need to build so that this doesn't happen again?" And this is where we enter the most important territory of this entire analysis. Because everything we have talked about so far, respect, limits, emotional autonomy, has one root, a single root from which everything else grows: purpose. The man who has a clear purpose, who knows where he is going and why he is going there, that man has something more valuable than any tactic, more powerful than any seduction technique, more lasting than any psychological strategy. He has direction. And direction, the sense that someone knows where they are headed in life, is one of the most deeply attractive signals that exist from an evolutionary standpoint. Think about it in evolutionary terms for a moment. For hundreds of thousands of years, survival depended on the ability to find resources, to navigate the environment, to make decisions under pressure. The man who had a clear direction was the one who brought food to the group, who led when the situation demanded it, who made decisions when others hesitated. And that ability generated, inevitably, respect and attraction. Today, the context has changed, but the psychological mechanism remains active. You don't need to lead a tribe, but you need to know what you want to build with your life. What kind of person you want to be. What matters enough to you to invest your time and energy in it beyond relationships. And when you have that, when you truly have it, and not just as something you say for appearances, everything changes. Not just how others perceive you, how you perceive yourself. And that difference is what moves everything. There is something I want to explain to you about emotional self-control, because it is probably the concept that generates the most confusion. Emotional self-control is not suppressing what you feel. It is not pretending it doesn't hurt when it does, or acting as if you don't care when you do. That is dissociation, and it is the opposite of what we are looking for. Emotional self-control is the ability to feel with full intensity what is happening without letting that intensity dictate your actions. Machiavelli wrote about virtue, a complex concept that translates poorly into English because it encompasses far more than virtue in the moral sense. Machiavellian virtue included the ability to adapt, to act with determination, to keep a cool head when circumstances try to steal your calm. It was the combination of inner strength and outer flexibility. Applied to emotions, this means you can feel anger without acting from anger. You can feel fear without letting fear make your decisions. You can feel the pain of rejection or distance without that pain driving you to behaviors you will later regret. And this is not something you are born with. It is something you train. The brain is extraordinarily plastic, and one of the most consistently repeated findings in neuroscience over the past 20 years is that the capacity for emotional regulation can be developed. It is not a fixed trait. It is not a destiny determined by your childhood or your natural temperament. It is a skill, and like any skill, it improves with deliberate practice. How is it practiced? Here is something that few people will tell you because it is not glamorous and does not sell well as a headline. Emotional regulation is practiced fundamentally in moments of small discomfort, not in great crises, in small ones. Every time you feel like sending that impulsive message and decide to wait. Every time you feel the urge to seek validation and decide not to, every time someone does something that bothers you and instead of reacting immediately, you let a few minutes pass, breathe, consciously decide how to respond. Each of those moments is a training session, and the accumulation of those sessions is what builds the emotional stability that makes people trust you, want to be near you, respect you. Now, I want to talk to you about something that has a simple name but hides an enormous psychological complexity: external validation. We all seek it. It is completely human to seek it. We need to know that we matter, that we are seen, that what we do has value to someone else. The problem is not seeking validation. The problem is when the validation of one specific person becomes the main criterion by which you judge your own worth. When that happens, and it happens in very subtle ways, every interaction with that person becomes an exam. If they reply to your message quickly, you pass. If they take a while, you fail. If they are in a good mood with you, the day is good. If they seem distant, the day is a disaster. And suddenly, your emotional state, your productivity, your ability to enjoy anything else in your life is held hostage by the mood and decisions of another person. This is not love. This is emotional dependency. As one reflection put it, emotional dependency feels like love until you remember that love doesn't cage you. Rely on people, but never so much that losing them means losing yourself. And the difference between the two is fundamental. Genuine love, the kind worth having, the kind sustainable over time, is what happens between two people who choose each other, who prioritize each other, who take care of each other, but neither of whom needs the other to function. Two complete lives that meet and decide to walk together, not two half-lives searching in the other for the missing half. The attraction generated by the first dynamic is enormous. The codependency of the second can create a very high emotional intensity at the beginning, a kind of passionate storm easily confused with deep love, but which is fundamentally unstable. Sooner or later, that dynamic wears both parties down. The dependent one, because they live in a state of permanent anxiety. The other, because they carry a weight they never asked for, and that ends up being exhausting. Machiavelli observed something about power that applies perfectly here. He wrote that whoever depends entirely on fortune is ruined when it changes. In relationships, fortune is the other's mood, their decisions, their attention. And the man who builds his stability on that is building on sand. I want to explore with you now a territory that is often discussed but rarely understood, the concept of limits. A limit is not a threat. It is not an ultimatum. It is not a way of controlling the other person. A limit is simply a declaration of what you are willing to tolerate and what you are not, and it belongs to you. It has nothing to do with what the other person does or doesn't do. It has everything to do with what you decide to accept in your life. The distinction is crucial. A man who says, "If you keep this up, I'm leaving," is trying to control someone else's behavior with a threat. A man who says, "This behavior is not something I accept in my life," and then acts accordingly, is not trying to change the other person. He is acting from his own clarity about what he wants and does not want. Why does this generate respect? Because it communicates something very specific about that person's psychology. It communicates that they have standards, that their presence is not a free and unconditional gift, but something that must be earned, that they value themselves enough not to remain in situations that make them feel small. And curiously, although it may seem contradictory, that is exactly what generates the desire to stay in the other person. Not always, not in all relationships, but in healthy ones. Because people who have a clear sense of their own value recognize and appreciate that same sense in others. The problem is that many men are afraid to set limits because they are afraid of losing. They have learned, somehow, that being demanding means being difficult, that having standards means being arrogant, that asking to be treated well is asking for too much, and that is one of the most destructive messages we have internalized as a society. You are not asking for too much when you ask to be treated with respect. You are not being difficult when you say there are things you don't accept. You are not being arrogant when you know clearly what you deserve. You are simply someone who knows themselves, and that, I repeat, is irresistible. Now, let's talk about something I find one of the most complex and interesting topics in all of relationship psychology, the difference between loneliness and abandonment. Abandonment is something that happens to you. Loneliness is something you choose. Many men tolerate relationships that don't do them good, relationships in which they feel invisible, undervalued, constantly in emotional debt, because the fear of loneliness is greater than the discomfort that relationship causes them. And that is understandable from a human standpoint, completely understandable. Loneliness hurts. The brain processes it as a threat. It is not a weakness to feel afraid of being alone, but there is a distinction that can change everything when you understand it deeply. Being alone and feeling lonely are not the same thing. You can be surrounded by people. You can be in a relationship. You can have a calendar full of social commitments and feel profoundly lonely. Or you can be physically alone with no one by your side at a specific moment and feel completely whole. The feeling of loneliness does not come from the absence of people. It comes from the absence of connection with yourself. And that connection, that relationship you have with your own life, with your own purpose, with your own values, is exactly what we are building when we talk about emotional autonomy. The man who has a rich and honest relationship with himself does not need another person to feel complete. He can desire someone, choose them, love deeply, but he doesn't need to. And that difference, that subtle but monumental difference, is what separates a healthy relationship from a codependent one. Machiavelli spoke of how the leader must be capable of being alone with his thoughts, of finding clarity in silence, of not needing the constant approval of the people to know he is making the right decisions. That ability to operate from within without constantly needing external validation is what allowed him to act with real freedom. In relationships, it works in exactly the same way. Emotional freedom, the freedom to choose without fear dictating the choice, is only possible when you don't need the other person to survive emotionally. I want to talk now about something concrete, something practical, because everything we have explored so far can remain at the level of ideas if we don't bring it down to earth. How does this actually begin to change in real life? It starts with a question that seems simple but requires brutal honesty to answer correctly. The question is, am I in this relationship or in this dynamic because I genuinely choose it or because I am afraid of what would happen if I weren't? That question is what distinguishes the man who loves from the man who depends. And the honest answer, the one that surfaces before the ego has time to intervene, will tell you everything you need to know. Because there are relationships we continue, not because they are good for us, but because we have invested so much in them that the idea of leaving feels like an unacceptable loss. Economists call this the sunk cost effect, and in relationships it works in a devastating way because it keeps us trapped in situations that don't build us up simply because we have already spent so much time, so much energy, so many emotions on them. But time that has passed cannot be recovered, and the relevant question is never how much you have already invested. The relevant question is always, what do you want to invest from this moment forward? Self-knowledge, the ability to look at yourself honestly and see both your strengths and your destructive patterns, is the starting point for everything. You cannot change what you cannot see, and you cannot see what you are not willing to look at. Machiavelli wrote that the prudent man always seeks the paths traveled by the great and tries to imitate those who have been excellent, not to achieve their exact greatness, but at least to carry their fragrance. What this means in modern terms is that learning from those who have walked the path before you, from those who have understood these mechanisms, is one of the most intelligent ways to move forward. You don't have to discover everything by yourself. You don't have to learn only through pain. You can choose to also learn through understanding, through reflection, through the conscious will to understand how your own psychology works so that you stop being its victim and become its master. And now I want to take you to a place that may be the most revealing of everything we have discussed. I want to talk to you about self-respect as a foundation, not as a consequence. Most people think of self-respect as something built after achievements, after getting the job, after the relationship, after the body, after external recognition. They understand it as a reward, as something earned when the world demonstrates you deserve to be respected. But it works exactly the other way around. Self-respect is not a reward. It is a decision made before the world proves anything to you. A decision activated in the smallest, most everyday moments, in the way you speak about yourself, in the way you allow others to speak to you, in the situations you tolerate and those you don't, in how you invest your time, in what kind of people you allow to occupy space in your life. And when that decision is truly made, when it is not a pose, but a conviction, the world begins to respond to you differently. Not because the world has changed, but because you have changed the information you transmit to it about how you should be treated. As Maya Angelou is often quoted as saying, if we lose love and self-respect for each other, this is how we finally die. And the inverse is equally true. When you maintain self-respect, even when love is uncertain, you remain alive to yourself. This is, at its core, the deepest lesson that can be drawn from Machiavelli applied to relationships. It is not about manipulating others. It is about governing yourself. The prince who cannot govern himself cannot govern anything. The man who cannot maintain his own emotional stability, who cannot act from his own values rather than from fear or need, that man cannot build anything solid with anyone. Everything begins and ends with you, with the relationship you have with yourself, with the honesty with which you look at yourself, with the commitment you have to your own growth, with the clarity you develop about what you want and what you don't want in your life. As Mark Manson articulated, non-neediness means you respect yourself and others. Narcissism means you only respect yourself. Neediness means you only respect others. The balanced man respects both himself and others equally, and that balance is what creates lasting attraction. And the last thing I want to leave you with, what strikes me as the synthesis of everything we have explored together, is this. Attraction is not achieved by being less. It is not achieved by reducing your needs, suppressing your emotions, feigning an indifference you don't feel. Genuine attraction, deep respect, the relationships that are truly worth having are built by being more yourself, more authentic, more committed to your own path, more capable of being well within yourself without depending on anyone to come and complete you. The man the world respects is not the one who has learned to need nothing. He is the one who has learned that he doesn't need the approval of others to know who he is, and that is a freedom no one can take from you because it depends on no one but yourself. The quote from the anonymous reflection captures this perfectly. The more we love, the more we lose. The more we lose, the more we learn. The more we learn, the more we love. It comes full circle. Life is the school, love is the lesson. We cannot lose. Because what you truly learn through loss cannot be taken from you. The lesson becomes part of you. And that lesson, hard as it may be, is what transforms you from a man who chases into a man who chooses. If you made it to the end, comment "I made it," and I will personally reply to you myself. And if this resonated with you, subscribe to be part of this and like it if you enjoyed it.